All right, everybody. It's good to see you. Let's see what we've got going on over here.
Sorry, Rabbi, I just wanted to remind you quick about
Yeah.
the sponsorship and
Okay.
dedicating the class in honor of all those that are sick. In
Sure.
particular, one of the founders of the SEA, Stanley Chera,
Sure.
and
Good
all
question.
those medical personnel and any doctors and nurses.
One slice, two slices.
Right.
Shlomo Ben Shoshana.
Okay, yeah.
Good.
So inshallah, the shiur should be the refuat, everybody who has, complications and difficulty with the virus. Mitoch shar kol cholei amo Yisrael, from everybody, from, amongst all of the cholim of Israel. And we should see an end to this as soon as possible. All right. Hope everybody's doing well. Let's get into it. We've got, I understand that I've got 30 minutes, so I hope that we'll be able to do this in 30 minutes, but I also want to give opportunities for questions. So if we don't have opportunities for questions, if we don't get to the end properly, we won't be able to get to the questions. So I'm going to do the best that I can to kind of put these ideas out. Yes. And let's see. There we go. Louis Adis. Hey, how you doing? Nice to see you. This is what I'd like to talk about tonight is the concept of time and freedom and how that interrelates and how it ultimately connects to Pesach. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put out some ideas, right, which are going to be base ideas that we're going to build on, that we're going to kind of use to be able to understand. And so I hope that everybody's with me and that we can go through this and focus. I also hope that everybody's muted. Yeah, I see that everybody's muted, but let's please make sure to mute everybody. If you have any questions, what I would like, please, if you can, is to write them in the chat, right? So on Instagram, if you have any questions, and on Instagram, what I would do is if you have questions, wait towards the end of the shiur to write the questions in. So you could either, not writing them, but you're typing the questions in the question box at the bottom, or if you want to type them in the comments themselves, that's fine. But try to do it towards the end so that I see them, because oftentimes they get pushed up and I don't see them. And for everybody who's on Zoom, type them in the chat and I'll take a look at them afterwards. So here's the concept. Yeah. It was really good to see everybody. I'm seeing such nice familiar faces. I miss you guys. I hope everybody's doing well. I hope everybody's doing well. Here's the thing. Here's the opening concepts. The first is that freedom has a tremendous amount to do with our consciousness, right? Our ability to be aware of a world. Yeah. So I want to talk about consciousness for a minute and how it is that consciousness affects our knowledge of a world and how it is that we engage in this world, right? The world as it is on its own, without our consciousness, has no meaning. It doesn't have anything about it inherently meaningful, right? In order for anything to have meaning, we need to be able to be aware of that meaning. And that is what ultimately gives meaning to us, right? So even if it's something that we look at in terms of Torah, we say that Torah gives meaning, it presents a framework of meaning for us, that's fine. And we definitely recognize that that's a reality for us, but it requires our consciousness to be able to recognize it, accept it, and see things in that way. Yeah. So consciousness is very much inherent, right? Inherent with meaning. Now, meaning itself, interestingly enough, requires something else in order for it to be meaningful. And this is where it's a little bit off, right? In other words, it's not something that is necessarily intuitive to us or that we think about because it's so much a part of our thought that we don't necessarily examine. And it is this. Meaning requires lack, right? It requires our ability to be able to see something, experience something, know something, and recognize something that is missing in it, something that it doesn't have. And we look at it and recognize its meaning based on what it is not, or what it does not have, right? What it is not doing yet for me, or in my experience of life. And I'll give you an example of that so that everybody understands. The only thing that I'm asking is that we've got to mute. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to open this, and I hope that I'll be able to do this. I don't know. Who's hosting this with me? I'm asking. Who's hosting this with me? Who's the co-host? Who's me? Mute everybody.
Yeah.
Thank
Everybody's
you.
muted.
Great. Lovely. So back to the point. Meaning is based on lack. Yeah, so I'll give you an example, right? Let's say we look at an unbaked cake, a very basic example, an unbaked cake. That unbaked cake is only unbaked because we recognize that there should be a cake eventually from the batter that we have, or from whatever period point, the unbaked cake is in its process of baking, right? In other words, that cake for itself is not unbaked. Whatever it is, it is. It just is what it is at any given point, at any point in the process, right? It is what it is. Now, it doesn't mean that in the real world, this is not going on. It is going on. This cake is being baked, but it is the meaning of that cake being baked. The fact that I understand it as being an unbaked cake only exists in my mind. It doesn't exist for the cake, qua the cake, right? I look at it and recognize in my mind that what it lacks is full baked cakeness. It doesn't have its status of cake right now. It will eventually become a cake, and I judge that an unbaked cake based on the lack of that cake being baked ultimately, or the full product, the ultimate product of that cake. All right, so I hope everybody's with me in that. And that is where meaning lies, because the meaning that this particular unbaked cake has for me is based on something that I know that is not at the present, that I'm expecting of it, and I'm putting on to this unbaked cake, right? I'm judging this unbaked cake based on what I ultimately want it to be. And that is the case with practically everything in our lives that we find to be of meaning, yeah? Interestingly, right, what we find, with a lot of people who want to teach, mindfulness or meditation and all that, especially currently, I don't know if anybody's done anything like that, right? One of the things that they tell you to do in classic meditation is not to look at things in terms of what they could be, should be, would be, but simply look at what it is with no judgment. Right? With no judgment. And what that's essentially saying is, by saying no judgment, is saying without meaning, right? Because what judgment is not just saying, we don't like the word judgment because very often judgment is connected to what we would call judgmental, and where we're giving some negative judgment onto something. And again, that's a question as to what it is that negative means. But ultimately, if I'm looking at something as it is in the world, without any judgment on it, I'm also looking at it without meaning anything. It doesn't mean anything to me. It just is. So in order for meaning to manifest, I require seeing something in what it lacks, that it requires something. It can be something, it will be something, it might be something. Now, imagine for a second that I live my life in a way in which I never see the current circumstance of my life as lacking, right? Which means that I also don't see the current circumstance of my life as having potential to be anything other than what it is right now. In other words, I accept the terms of my life as they are, and I do not entertain a lack in my life as it is now, meaning I do not see that my life needs to become, could become, might become something else in a future. I simply accept and know my life as it is without any other determinations made. The question that I will ask you to consider is, in such a situation, how free is that person? If a person cannot, and I'm saying cannot because there could be a situation where a person will not, right? But that's also a choice, yeah? So let's leave that for a moment. Where a person cannot entertain in their lives alternatives, potentials to what is happening right now, the current circumstance of their life. It's very difficult for us to imagine and to entertain because we happen to be very free people. And we happen to be people that are constantly questioning what is missing on things. But contemplate for a minute, what might life be if I could not do that. Couldn't see that what's happening right now has other alternatives, options, potentials. That the cake that I see that is being baked in the oven, isn't baked yet, being baked in the oven, I look at it and realize that this is just something that's in front of me. I don't know from the cake that it might be in the future. I have no contemplation of the cake that it might be in the future. I have an acorn that I know if I plant, you take an acorn, you plant it into the ground, it'll become an oak tree. But I don't know from the oak tree. And I don't look at the acorn as an unoaked oak tree. I simply look at it as what it is with no other judgment whatsoever. How free is such an individual? What I'm suggesting is that such an individual is not free. Such an individual cannot be free. An individual that is incapable of entertaining lack, entertaining what something might be in the future but is not now, judging something now based on what it is that they could, would, should be in the future. If I don't have that at all, then I really cannot be free, because I cannot entertain alternatives to the reality that is happening right now, right this moment in front of me. And what that means is that time, obviously time is lurking in the back of all of this. What that means is that time is essential and central to freedom. Because without time, if I don't recognize a future and I don't look at a past that will be seen in terms of a future, if all I have is what is right in front of me, I cannot be free. So I need time in order for me to be able to be free. And the interesting thing is that the less that I have capacity to be able to entertain alternative situations for myself, right? To be able to entertain other possibilities for myself, the less I'm free. And that is exactly what was going on in Egypt, right? In other words, Paro recognizes this problem. Paro recognizes that Bnei Israel properly, as slaves, should not entertain anything else but what their life is right now, because their life didn't belong to them. They were slaves of Paro. Paro should be the only one that entertains possibilities in their lives. They, as slaves, should not have capacity to be able to entertain their lives, to be able to see anything other than what it is that was going on right now. That means that outside of the job and task that they needed to do in this time or in this moment should be the only thing that they can consider. And the only alternatives or lackings that they could consider is pre-bricks and post-bricks to reduce it, right? In other words, I've got materials for bricks and ultimately I get a brick, and that's it. I really shouldn't be able to entertain anything else. Now you may argue, listen, an intelligent slave can extrapolate from that. If I can have pre-brick and post-brick, and I understand that the stuff that's there before brick really is brick stuff, and the only way that I know that it's brick stuff, which means that the meaning of the straw and the mortar and all of them, the mud and everything, the meaning of that is based on what it lacks, which is what? The brick. Because I bring my consciousness to it. And it's what I bring my consciousness to that allows for something to be anything other than what it is. The problem is that they weren't just contemplating what was material for bricks and bricks. They were contemplating slavery and freedom. They were contemplating their current life and the possibilities of an alternative life. They were contemplating that. And that was the problem. And what the core of their issue was that they looked at their life now and saw lack in it. And they found meaning in their life based on the lack that they had. And what was part of that lack, right? It was important because that lack was instilled in the people from the time of Yosef. Because what Yosef says to the people before he dies is, right? Yosef makes Bnei Israel swear and says to them, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to take you out one day. He's going to send somebody, he's going to take you out. And when you get out, take my bones with you. That's the last thing that Yosef says to the people. So what does he instill in them? He instills in them the lack to what is in the current situation. You're here now, you will not always be here. Somebody's going to come and take you out. And when that person comes and takes you out, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu pulls you out of here, then you take my bones with you. So what does that create immediately? It creates this situation of a life in which I am constantly looking at an alternative for what it is that I've got. I know that what I have now is missing. There's something lacking in it. And that, of course, has everything to do with Mashiach, doesn't it? It's the exact same thing for us. The Jewish story is not done. The Jewish story is not complete. The Jewish story is never complete for us, no matter what. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But it's a shocking thing that for us, there's always something missing. And there's many levels of things missing. But the ultimate thing for us, what we would say is missing. There's no Mashiach. Oh, how we need Mashiach. If Mashiach came, everything would make it better. But it wouldn't be better. Right? Because the minute that Mashiach came, which would be a wonderful occurrence, we would immediately be post-Mashiach. And if we were post-Mashiach, there would be all the stuff that Mashiach needs to do and what we need to accomplish and so on and so forth. There's never a situation, you understand? There is never a situation in which there is a lack that is absolved. There is always something missing. There is always something that needs to be accomplished and done. The only place that we know that there shouldn't be such a thing is in Olam Haba, in which you'll say, well, is Olam Haba a place of slavery or freedom? Well, that's a good question. And it's something that the Hachamim say, look, Enli Cheshek Bahem. It's not something that we look forward to necessarily. But that's not for tonight's shiur. That's for another shiur. I'm simply throwing it out there for you. Come back to the issue of Mitzrayim. And when Paro is told that the people are contemplating a possibility that is an alternative to what it is that they're doing, his response to that is, nirpim him. They must be very lazy people. Because if they have time to contemplate anything other than making bricks, this whole thing is messed up. The whole thing is messed up. They're slaves. There shouldn't be anything else on their mind except the task of making bricks. And so we can take care of that, Moshe. I will take care of that, Moshe. All we have to do is make sure that they do not have time on their hands. Because as long as they have time, they contemplate time. They entertain alternatives for their time. And they have the ability to be able to entertain possibilities. We have to take their time away from them, which by the way, it's a serious thing to steal time from people. It's not a joke. It's not a joke. I'm just pausing on that for a minute. We have to be extremely careful, not only with our own time, but how it is that we deal with other people's time. Because it's only in time that we have the capacity to be able to extend and exercise our freedoms. When we steal time from people, we steal something precious from them. That is a serious offense. So Paro steals time from the people, and he says, listen, I'm taking the straw away. No more straw. Because the very fact that they're being provided the straw is what's giving them time to contemplate these things. Time to contemplate these things is giving them the opportunities for freedom, because they have an ability in the first place to even contemplate what's missing in their lives. And that's the thought of a free person. What's missing in my life? What can I do in order to be able to create a situation in which I'm no longer in this situation? If that's not freedom, what is? That's the ability to be able to create what it is that you want in this life. And in order to do that, you need to be able to see a lack. That lack will define the meaning of your current state, and you do something in order to be able to achieve it. And that happens with the most mundane things, and it happens with the most complex and sophisticated things. That is the one underlying fundamental in all of the nature of living a free life. So Paro takes that away from them. And that is a serious thing. And that's why it says that the minute that started happening, is they couldn't speak to Moshe. They had no kotzer. All of their breath, all of their ability to be in their life was cut short because they had no time anymore. And because they had no time, they had no ability to be able to entertain possibilities and alternatives. Shimon Peres has a great line. He says, the definition of the Jewish people is that they are dissatisfied. It's a beautiful line by Shimon Peres. He says, I quoted it, I wrote down the quote of it. He says, the Jews' greatest contribution to history is dissatisfaction. The greatest thing that they give to the world is dissatisfaction, which is essentially this recognition of lack. We're a nation born to be discontented, he says. The Jewish people are a nation born to be discontented. We are never content. And it's another way, although I don't know that he was consciously thinking of it, there's another way of saying that the Jewish people are born for freedom. It is who we are. It is the nature of our lives. We are born to contemplate constantly what is a better way of living, which means that we're constantly unhappy on a certain level, or perhaps a better way to say it, I shouldn't say unhappy. A better way to say it is that we're never satisfied. On a certain level, a free person is never satisfied, because a free person recognizes that there is always something that can be altered for better. There is something lacking that can be addressed. And that's always the case in our lives. And that's okay, but I'm going to develop that a little bit. I'm going to round that out a little bit. And so he finishes his quote saying, whatever exists, we believe can be changed for the better. So that's Shimon Peres about the Jews. And I think that has everything to do with Pesach and freedom and time. So time is essential. Time is essential. And where do we find time as far as Pesach is concerned? Where do we find it? Of course, in the one central issue of Pesach. It's called the Hag HaMatzot, because matzah is all about time. In other words, the whole difference, I'm sure you've heard this many times before, I've heard it many times, that the only difference between matzah and hametz is time. But it's also consciousness, right? In other words, what we ate, it's interesting, right? The matzah has two faces to it. The matzah is the bread of our slavery, right? The achlu of hatana be'arad Mitzrayim. Our forefathers ate it in Egypt. When did they eat it in Egypt? As slaves. You think they gave them baguettes in Egypt? They gave them this cracker, these poorly burnt crackers, which is basically what matzah is. That's what they gave them to eat. But the different, and then what ends up happening? We leave Mitzrayim because we don't have time. In order to be able to get all of our stuff together, we got to get out of there very, very quickly, yeah, in order to be able to run. And what we end up with is the same bread that we were eating when we were slaves in Egypt. But then it becomes freedom bread. Why? What's going on over there with that? The bread that is given to us as slaves in Mitzrayim is all we know. There's nothing else for us. We don't entertain, wow, how nice it would be to have a baguette. We don't have an option for it. We don't have the time to be able to bake good bread. We get only what it is that we're given, which means all we have is what we have, and that's it. There are no other alternatives. You can't contemplate anything else, essentially, yeah, in Mitzrayim. And when we come out, the command for us is watch those matzot. Ushmartem et hamatzot. I'm going to look at that pasuk in a second because it's a beautiful pasuk for all of this. But it's the Torah says to us, watch those matzot, because they might become hametz. And all of a sudden, as free people, we have to entertain what the ultimate possibility is, or what the future possibility is of what it is, the bread that I'm eating over here. What will happen to this? And all the Torah says to me is, watch it. Don't let it get there. But that also means that in order for it not to get there, you cannot take your consciousness off of it. Your capacity for free thought is in that consciousness, in recognizing the lack. This is not hametz yet. And you need to recognize the lack. And you need to be able to be shomer that matzah, so that on Pesach night you can look at it and say, this isn't hametz. It's missing being hametz. And as a matter of fact, the amazing thing is that the Ramchal writes, I'm going to do this tomorrow night on my 8 o'clock shiur, the Ramchal writes that hametz is what it's supposed to be. What do I mean by that? That's what bread is meant to be. Bread is meant to be hametz. It's meant to be hametz. Nobody can digest matzah. It's not meant to be what it is that I eat. That the Ramchal points out in the Derech Hashem. And I'm supposed to look at that matzah and recognize that it's missing that component, and understand that the only way that it gets there and is hametz for me in any meaningful way, and that this matzah is non-hametz, right? Ugot matzot ki lo hametz, the pasuk says. They have to be ugot matzot, not hametz. So it constantly juxtaposes the lack with what it is that it is now. And I need to be able to see it as a free man, knowing I could make this into hametz if I wanted to. I could bring it into hametz, but on Pesach I'm required to keep it as matzah, so that the potential gap and lack that thing is inherent with is clear to me. That I need to acknowledge that the only way that this matzah is matzah ugot matzot kilo hametz is because I know that it could be hametz. Is that my consciousness, the very mechanism of my freedom, is aware that it's not hametz. And that is essential and integral to the whole nature of freedom of Pesach, that I should look at this and recognize that it could be otherwise, and that I would even want it to be otherwise. And that it is in that recognition of lack that my freedom lives, that my freedom ultimately exists, because freedom always sees potentials. And potential, by definition, is lacking, by definition. And that's an essential point. And so that's why in the pasuk that tells me to watch the matzot, it's extremely dramatic because it looks at the development of time. So listen to this pasuk. The pasuk says, "Vayhi miketz," and it was at the end of 30 shana ve'arba me'ot shana, of 430 years. Vayhi be'etzem hayom hazeh, and it was on that very day at that time. Yatz'u kol tzivot Adonai me'eretz Mitzrayim. All of the legions of God left Egypt, which is essentially Bnei Israel. And then it continues, says, Leil shimurimhu ladonai lehotziyah me'eretz Mitzrayim. It was a night that God kept vigil for. It was a night that God watched and protected. God's consciousness, kavyachol, God's freedom, looked at a current circumstance and defined it entirely in terms of what was missing. And it was in that ultimately the Geulah happened. The Geulah only happened against the backdrop of it not being there, of it not happening, of it not being part of what these people were. Now, that they ultimately needed to achieve that, and that this was done for 430 years. Hu halayla hazel Adonai shimurim. This night kept watch by God for 430 years. B'chol b'nei Israel, for all of b'nei Israel. And the last word is l'dorotam, for all of their generations, which means that ultimately what we learn on Pesach, a very important lesson that we learn on Pesach, is that the time is everything. That the very time that is the difference, genuinely, the difference between matzah and hametz, that the very consciousness that is required in order for matzah to be matzah and not hametz, that the very consciousness that is aware of the fact that my matzah is matzah because it isn't hametz, and I recognize that that is lacking in this matzah, is the seed of my freedom. And that without that consciousness and without that awareness of my world, I cannot be free. Because you know who looks at matzah and simply looks at it as my bread? A slave. You know who looks at what is and simply recognizes what is? Or as we might say, it is what it is? A slave. That's it. Now, it's true that there are certain circumstances, as we've said this many times, and I think that it should be said, could be said, just to highlight it, that there are many circumstances in which we do not have control, and that it is just what it is. But what we always have control over is my consciousness and how I relate to a situation. And even in those situations, there are lackings. Can I be compassionate? Can I give of myself? Can I make it better in any way? What's lacking here? And so the lackings are essential. They're very, very important. And it goes all the way back to the questions of being and non-being. Because the meaning of a chair for me is some place that I may sit one day. The meaning of a book for me is something that I might read and that I might learn and that I then might implement into my life and then I might teach and so on and so forth. And that's the case with all things. When I live a life in which I don't see things that way, or that seeing those things are limited, in which I simply just take my life as it is, without judgment, without seeing any lack in it, without looking at it against the backdrop of a future and potential, I essentially succumb to slavery. And that is a heinous crime, especially for Bnei Israel. It's a danger. And the thing that we forget is that it may be that many of us choose to live that way, but the first action in terms of living that way, and when I say that way, I mean in terms of just living the life as it goes without contemplating any alternatives, that too is a choice. That too requires freedom, because you recognize the alternative and you choose what is in front of you only. And so I think it is important for us to recognize that there is something about being also that is valuable. Because what I'm talking about now and what I've been talking about for the last 30 minutes is becoming, because the world is constantly becoming, and we are constantly being hurtled to the future, constantly being hurtled to the future. And it's being hurtled to the future that my consciousness is aware of that allows for me to be free. But there's also something in terms of understanding and being present in where I am right now and understanding what it is as it is while I contemplate its alternative. And that is the greatest achievement. And it is the most difficult achievement. It is the most difficult. And it is ultimately what a high-level free person does, in which I see what the situation is in front of me as it is, without judgment, and then I choose how it is that I'm going to see it and what lackings I recognize in it. And that, amazingly, is always my choice. And so ultimately, Torah is meant to inform that for us. Torah is meant to guide us and aim us towards which lackings we should see. What should we want to be here? But the concept in and of itself is part of what freedom is. And I will say, it's not always the fact that our freedom brings us into good things. Sometimes the lackings that we see are things that are quite counterproductive. Sometimes the things that we don't see or that we want to be that aren't are not necessarily things that are helpful for us if they are brought into reality or if we choose to change them. But a concept that I wanted to share with everyone, I hope not too out of reach. I hope that it was close enough that we can kind of understand it and think about it in our lives and ultimately see it against the backdrop of Pesach and Haggadah. I'll take a few minutes. So I want to mention again, in case anybody is interested, if you're on Instagram, you can always look on Instagram, but I'm on Instagram Live every night at during this very difficult and challenging situation. Yeah, and that again is a judgment of mine on a certain level. During this time, I am on every night in the UK at 8 p.m., which means now that we've moved our classes forward, I am on every afternoon at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And there was somebody who said that 3 p.m. is too late or too early for anything, but I am sorry that it falls out that way, but it is unfortunately what I can offer at the time, at the moment. And so the Zoom, it's also on Zoom, but it's not on this Zoom. So you can check, for the Zoom code or with the Zoom ID on my Instagram and on my, my social media and stuff, and I put it out there. Okay, so let's take some quick time to see if we've got any questions. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Okay, I'm gonna go from bottom up. If we are, let's see here. If we, thank you. If we are supposed to be striving for more, how can we ever be content with our lot? So I think I just mentioned that. I think you have to see, first of all, your lot is a recognition of a certain level of your being, who you are. Who is the one that's making the judgment of the lack? Who is the one that's conscious? Who is the one? That's part of what being sameach b'chelko means, right? Being sameach in who you are and the person that you are in this world. And there is definitely a requirement of a certain recognition or understanding of my being in terms of who it is that I am. Recognizing a lack or potential, but never acting on it, still free. You are free. You are fundamentally free. You are always free. You may not be exercising your freedom, but the ability to be able to recognize it is a fundamental freedom. That's fundamentally how it is that you are, just that you may not be acting on it. I don't feel free at the moment. We are not free to leave our homes. We are lacking, but the lack feels like the opposite of freedom. I understand that that's maybe what it feels like. That was also the first Mitzrayim. Pesach Mitzrayim was also stuck at home, and yet it was a free experience. The question is, in your current situation, in your state, what lacking can you recognize that filling will be positive for you? What's missing? That filling could be positive for you. How do you set up your Pesach, right, in a way that is going to nourish you and enhance your situation? Is it perfect? No. Is it exactly how it is that you want it to be? No. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a lack in the current situation that you can affect, and you can choose to affect it in the most positive way that you can. There's no question about that. So I encourage you to do that, rather than recognizing that what you ultimately want is not necessarily there or at your grasp. Hey, you're hoping to get to that on their own, and that by recognizing they are doing what they, no, I'm looking, wait, oh my, many things. I know, everyone's going to say, right? Gaining a sense of consciousness, world around you, creation, and this power. By doing that, one can see and then look at where they are. Look, yes, I mean, somebody's asking over here in terms of consciousness. Of course, one can always broaden their consciousness. Look, I'll use children as an example. Based on what it is that I've defined, for all intents and purposes, children are slaves because there's a tremendous limit to what it is that they understand as far as time and potential is concerned, correct? Always. I mean, that's a very big problem. Children don't have the ability to contemplate alternative realities than the one, I mean, I don't say they don't have. They have a very limited capacity. Also because they have a very limited understanding of time, right? You have to tell them, when I was little, people would have to tell me, look, I'm going, we'll be back in 2 Sesame Streets. I don't know what it is now, but that's what it was when I was little. And that, okay, I get, all right, how long does it take to take two Sesame Streets, right? Anyway, I think that I have to wrap up, unfortunately, and I'm not able to answer all of these questions, which I wish I could answer. But anyway, in answer to complete that particular question with the answer is, you begin small and you broaden. Yes, definitely one can broaden consciousness. Absolutely one can broaden consciousness. And there are many ways to do that. They're studying the world, they're studying Torah, there's all kinds of things. But there's no question about it. All right, I think I have to get off the platform because they're probably waiting for me. I really do appreciate everybody tuning in. I hope that everybody's well. I wish everybody health, strength, blessings, and that all things ultimately are good and with beracha. And I wish everybody a Pesach Sameach, that you should have a good Pesach. And although this is perhaps a different Pesach than what is it you're used to, well, be in it, see it for the positive elements that it can be, and recognize that at the end of the day, HaKadosh Baruch Hu flows through all of it. And this is where he's bringing us. And so we can choose to accept it and to make it into its most positive component. I will be trying, and so I encourage you to do the same as well. Thank you, everybody. I'm sorry if I'm not able to get to all of the questions at the end, but I think that I don't want to hog the platform for the next person who's coming on. But sending love, really, really sending love to everybody. It's so good to see you. So good to see you. Inshallah, you should all be well and strong. L'chaim tovim.